Poor pregnant maid saves for a tiny home. What she found inside changed it all. Janie stood in front of the small sage green house, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Her hands shook as she held the keys, hands that had scrubbed floors, washed sheets, and carried heavy buckets for months just to get here. Mrs. Thornhill, the elderly woman she cleaned for, stood beside her, smiling softly. With a deep breath, Janie turned the key. The door creaked open. Her eyes widened. The tiny home wasn't empty. It was warm, alive. A cozy couch sat by the corner, sunlight hit a handmade cradle beside the window, and a small kitchen shimmered with clean dishes and stocked shelves. Her knees almost gave out. She clutched the door frame, one hand on her belly, tears filling her eyes. None of this made sense. She knew she hadn't bought furniture, let alone baby supplies. Who could have done this? And why? Her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. If you want to know how Janie's story began and what she discovered inside this house, make sure to subscribe, comment where you're watching from, and stay tuned for tomorrow's episode. Thank you for supporting powerful stories like this one. The morning train screeched into North Philadelphia Station before sunrise, and Janie was already waiting with her lunch bag pressed against her belly. The wind bit through her thin coat, but she didn't flinch. It was her third year working as a housemaid in Rittenhouse Square, cleaning homes that looked like they belonged in magazines. By the time most people were still turning in their beds, she was already wiping marble counters that cost more than her rent. Every weekday began the same way. She boarded the Scepter train at 5:15 a.m., standing for most of the ride to save energy for later, her swollen feet tucked under the seat. She'd press her hand against her belly as if reminding herself why she had to keep going. The train's rhythm almost lulled her to sleep before jolting awake at Suburban Station, where she changed lines toward the wealthier neighborhoods. Her studio apartment back in North Philadelphia was barely bigger than a storage unit. The paint peeled from the walls, the heater worked only sometimes, and the pipes groaned whenever she ran water. 2 weeks ago, her landlord had left a note taped to her door, "No infant allowed." She hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Her boyfriend, the baby's father, had walked out months earlier after hearing the news of her pregnancy. He said he wasn't ready to be a father and disappeared with her savings. Now, she stood on her own, cleaning 4 or 5 homes a day just to stay ahead of eviction. Each house was its own world, chandeliers sparkling above spotless tables, the faint scent of roses or vanilla candles, music humming softly from Bluetooth speakers. The homes belonged to people who owned companies, wrote books, or worked jobs she didn't fully understand. They called her Sweet Janie, always polite, but rarely looked her in the eyes for long. Between tasks, she sometimes caught glimpses of herself in the mirror she cleaned. The same brown eyes, the same tired smile she forced on even the hardest days. Her belly had grown heavier, her back hurt from scrubbing floors, and sometimes she felt dizzy while dusting tall bookshelves. Yet she never cut corners. If a shelf was dirty behind the vase, she cleaned it anyway. If she was told to finish by noon, she stayed an extra 10 minutes to make sure the job was perfect. It wasn't for praise, most people didn't notice, but because she refused to lose her dignity. The contrast between her world and her clients never stopped stinging. She'd mop a floor while overhearing conversations about vacations in Italy or private schools for children younger than her unborn baby. When one client's toddler threw away a plate of food untouched, she quietly thought about how long a simple meal could last her if rationed right. But she never showed resentment. When spoken to, she answered with warmth. When tipped, she thanked them as though it were the greatest kindness in the world. After her 4th shift one day, she leaned on the rail outside a townhouse, her breath coming in slow, shallow waves. Her hands smelled of bleach, and her knees felt weak. The sun was setting, casting a dull orange glow across the cobblestone streets of Rittenhouse Square. People hurried by in heavy coats, arms full of shopping bags. Janie stood there for a moment, one hand over her belly, wondering if her child would ever know comfort, or if life would always mean chasing hours and counting pennies. At night, back in her small apartment, she'd cook rice and frozen vegetables, the cheapest meal she could manage. She'd fold baby clothes donated from a church near Broad Street, tiny honnesses she couldn't believe would soon fit a real person. Sometimes, she'd hold them to her face, thinking about the world she wanted her child to grow up in. Sleep came late and light. The noise from the next-door apartment never stopped, and the baby inside her kicked often. When it got too loud, she whispered softly, "We're going to make it. I don't know how yet, but we will." Her life was not defined by pity, though. The people she cleaned for might have seen her as poor, but she carried herself with quiet strength. She refused to let bitterness take root. Each morning, she tied her hair into a bun, wiped away tired tears, and left for work again before dawn. She told herself that one day, she wouldn't just clean other people's homes, she'd have one of her own. She didn't know how or when, but the thought never left her. It was the one light she held onto through every long train ride, every aching step, and every lonely night. It was the small seed of hope that, in time, would grow into something much greater. Lunch breaks were Janie's only quiet moments in the day. She'd sit on a worn wooden bench at Rittenhouse Square Park, her sandwich wrapped in foil and her phone balanced on her knee. Around her, mothers pushed strollers, toddlers laughed as they chased pigeons, and business people rushed by with coffee cups and phones glued to their ears. Janie's world stood still in that hour. She would eat slowly, gaze at the families, and wonder what it would feel like to have a place where her child could laugh without someone telling her to keep the noise down. Her phone was an old model with a cracked corner, but it was her window to possibility. One chilly afternoon, while searching for affordable housing near Philadelphia, she stumbled on a video about the tiny home movement. It showed people building small houses on trailers, compact, debt-free spaces designed for simple living. She watched with growing interest as the narrator explained how some homes cost less than a used car. The video ended with a woman standing proudly beside her little wooden cabin, smiling as she said, "Freedom is owning your space, no matter how small." Those words stuck with Janie. That night, back in her apartment, she replayed the video again and again. The next day, she spent her break reading articles and scrolling through listings of pre-owned tiny homes. Most were priced between $15,000 and $20,000. Some were already built and ready for delivery. Others required small plots of land, rural spaces in Lancaster County or the Pocono Mountains where the air was quiet and rent was cheap. She started to think, really think, about what it would take. She made calculations in her head, then in her notebook. Her weekly pay from cleaning 4 homes brought in about $620. After taxes, transportation, food, and rent, she could maybe save $50 a week. At that rate, it would take years. She frowned, drew a line through the numbers, and started again, this time imagining she could take extra weekend jobs, maybe skip a few expenses. It wasn't easy math, but it was something concrete, something she could chase. The more she researched, the stronger the idea grew. She read stories of single mothers who built homes from scratch using reclaimed wood, of people who escaped rent cycles by living small but owning everything inside. The thought of owning even one room of her own felt like a dream too big to say out loud. Yet she whispered it anyway, as if speaking might make it real. Over the next few days, she began saving screenshots of tiny homes, some shaped like cottages with flower boxes under the windows, others sleek and modern with solar panels. She imagined cooking in one, rocking her baby in a small corner by the window. Every new picture she saved brought her closer to believing it could happen. During her breaks, she began writing in her notebook, not just lists of cleaning supplies or train schedules, but plans. Goal: $10,000. Time: 8 months. She outlined what each month would require, down to the dollar. Rent: groceries, transportation, baby supplies, savings. She didn't tell anyone. It felt too fragile to share, like a spark that could be snuffed out by laughter or doubt. Her co-workers sometimes talked about getting better jobs or moving out of the city, but Janie stayed quiet. None of them knew that she was already working on her escape. Her plan wasn't just about survival, it was about building something lasting. For the first time in months, her thoughts before sleep weren't filled with fear but with blueprints and numbers. She learned about land prices through online listings. Some small plots near Lancaster sold for under $5,000, empty fields with trees and a bit of gravel road. It wasn't much, but it was space, and space meant freedom. She even found a forum where people shared advice about living off-grid. Someone wrote, "You don't need much to start. Just determination." She smiled at that. Determination was the one thing she still had plenty of. The more she thought about it, the more she saw the path ahead. It was narrow and steep, but it existed. She would need to save aggressively, take every extra job she could find, and spend nothing beyond necessity. It meant sacrificing comfort for a future she could touch. She knew she would have to choose between warmth and savings, sleep and work, rest and progress. Yet she didn't hesitate. Every kick from her baby reminded her that giving up wasn't an option. One evening, after finishing a long day cleaning a townhouse near Fitler Square, she walked past a real estate office. In the window, glossy photos of sprawling homes lined the glass. She stared for a moment before turning away. Those places weren't for her. Not now. But someday, even if it was just a single room with a window that let in sunlight, she'd call it hers. That night, she returned home with a new focus. She pulled her phone charger close, opened her notebook, and wrote across a clean page, "Tiny Home Fund." Underneath, she wrote her first entry, balance, $0. It didn't discourage her. It felt like a beginning. She closed the notebook, placed her hand over her belly, and whispered softly, "We're going to have a home." From that day on, her dream stopped being just an idea. It became a mission, one built from exhaustion, hope, and faith that even the smallest home could hold the biggest kind of peace. By December, Janie's life had turned into a rhythm of exhaustion. She rose before the first hint of daylight and returned home long after the sun was gone. Her schedule stretched from 5:30 in the morning to nearly 8 o'clock at night, 7 days a week, no exceptions. She took every cleaning job she could find, whether it was a 2-hour session for an elderly client in South Philadelphia or a last-minute booking from an Airbnb host downtown. If someone called, she said yes, even when her body begged for rest. Her Sundays, once her only free day, became meal prep days. She'd spend hours cooking rice, beans, and lentils, portioning them into small plastic containers to last the week. She couldn't afford to eat out, not even at the corner deli she used to treat herself to once a month. Her refrigerator was nearly empty except for the meals she'd planned carefully. Food that stretched, meals that filled without costing much. Winter came early and harsh that year. Instead of taking the bus, she began walking long stretches to save the $4 fare. She wrapped her coat tightly around her belly and braved the freezing winds, her gloves too thin to block the chill. The soles of her shoes wore down until she could feel the cracks in the pavement beneath her feet. Some nights, she soaked her swollen ankles in a bucket of warm water before bed, her body trembling with fatigue. She found maternity clothes at a thrift shop on Frankfort Avenue, shirts that didn't quite fit and pants that had to be pinned. Still, she was grateful for them. Every dollar saved went into the notebook she carried everywhere. It was old and bent, its pages covered in numbers and dates. She tracked every deposit, $200, $450, $780, $1,100. She'd open it at night before bed, running her finger down the page, whispering, "We're getting closer." Her apartment grew colder as winter deepened. The landlord turned off the building's main heater for repairs, and weeks passed with no change. Janie slept in layers of clothes, wrapping herself in blankets to keep warm. She cut her own hair one night to save money, standing in front of the cracked bathroom mirror with dull scissors. The uneven strands didn't bother her. Vanity was a luxury she couldn't afford anymore. The emotional weight pressed hardest during moments of silence. Friends she once met up with on South Street or at Penn's Landing for evening walks stopped calling. They sent the occasional text, "You okay?" But she rarely had the energy to reply. Every missed outing, every message left unanswered reminded her that her world had narrowed to work and survival. She wasn't angry, just lonely. Still, she told herself it was temporary. She repeated it like a promise, 5 more months, and everything will be different. The pregnancy made everything harder. Each morning, her back ached before she even left the apartment. Her belly felt heavier by the day, and the swelling in her feet made it painful to stand for long hours. On the train, she often held back tears, pretending to look out the window while her eyes glistened. Sometimes she'd rest her head against the glass and whisper quietly, "Hold on a little longer, baby. Mommy's trying." Still, she never missed a shift. Not one. Even when her body screamed for rest, she kept moving. She cleaned staircases with one hand braced on the wall for balance, dusted tall shelves while fighting dizziness, and knelt to scrub floors until her knees throbbed. Her clients noticed her growing belly but rarely said more than, "You should rest more." They didn't see her late nights counting cash or writing numbers in her notebook by candlelight when the power flickered out. The notebook became her anchor. Every new entry, every small increase, was proof that her sacrifices mattered. But progress was painfully slow. One week she'd save $80. The next, only $20. Each setback hit harder than the last. A sudden medical bill from a prenatal checkup wiped out 2 weeks of savings. A hole in her coat forced her to spend $50 she couldn't spare. When she lost a full day's work to a fever, she sat on her bed in tears, staring at the notebook as though it might give her strength. There were moments she nearly gave up. One cold night, after walking home through sleet, she found her apartment door leaking water from the ceiling. The landlord shrugged it off. She sat on her bed, her shoes still wet, her hands trembling, and whispered, "Maybe I can't do this." But then she felt a soft movement from inside her belly. Her baby kicked, light but certain, and she broke down crying. It was enough to make her pick up the notebook again, flip to the last page, and write another goal: keep going. Her world became a loop of labor and hope. Every day, she left before dawn with her lunch bag and notebook tucked inside her coat. Every night, she returned home to record her progress, no matter how small. She learned to ignore hunger pangs, to push through back pain, to smile through exhaustion when clients praised her work. By the end of the 5th month, she had saved $4,900. It wasn't close to her dream goal, but it was proof that she could make progress even under impossible conditions. Her reflection in the mirror had changed, thinner, eyes tired, but stronger. The kind of strength that came from surviving days that should have broken her. As she closed her notebook one night, she pressed it to her chest and whispered again to her unborn child, "We're almost there." The lights flickered overhead, and she sat quietly in the dim room, letting the silence wrap around her. She was exhausted beyond words, but her resolve was unshaken. Every sacrifice had built toward something larger, something waiting for her beyond the cold, beyond the pain, beyond this small apartment that no longer felt like home. Janie had worked for many families over the years, each household carrying its own rhythm, its own expectations. Some clients treated her like background noise, polite but distant, while others surprised her with small moments of care that reminded her she wasn't invisible. These gestures never erased the hardship, but they softened its edges. In Chestnut Hill lived Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd once taught elementary school. Her house was filled with framed photos of children and a faint scent of lavender. Janie cleaned there every Wednesday, polishing the same oak furniture and dusting the same bookshelf full of worn novels. Mrs. Patterson often sat in her rocking chair while Janie worked, knitting scarves and humming softly to old radio songs. One afternoon, as Janie packed her supplies to leave, she noticed an envelope on the counter with her name written in shaky handwriting. Inside was a folded $20 bill and a small note that read, "For the baby." It wasn't a one-time gesture. Every week after that, there was another envelope waiting in the same spot, sometimes with $5, sometimes $10. Janie tried to refuse once, telling Mrs. Patterson it wasn't necessary, but the older woman just smiled and said, "You remind me of my daughter when she was expecting. Let me help." The extra money went straight into the notebook fund, recorded carefully under the date with a small heart beside it. In Society Hill, Janie worked for the Kowalski couple, both in their early 30s, full of energy and kindness. They were the type who left thank you notes on the kitchen counter after every cleaning. When they learned Janie was expecting, they started setting aside things they no longer needed: baby bottles, a changing mat, a small crib with a missing wheel. "We're happy to see it go to someone who'll use it," Mrs. Kowalski said one evening as she handed Janie a box of baby clothes. Janie thanked her quietly, tears stinging her eyes. She didn't have space for most of it yet, so she rented a small storage area near the Italian market, paying $20 a month to keep everything safe until she found a place of her own. Her most challenging but rewarding clients were Dr. and Mrs. Thornhill in Haverford. They were older, refined, the kind of couple who had lived through years of discipline and success. Dr. Thornhill had once been a surgeon, his hands now unsteady with age. Mrs. Thornhill had taught English at the University of Pennsylvania before retiring. Their home was filled with books, art, and quiet. Unlike some clients, they spoke to Janie with genuine curiosity. They asked about her day, her health, and occasionally offered her tea before she started cleaning. It was during one of these visits, while polishing the kitchen counter, that Janie mentioned her tiny home plan for the first time. The thought had been living in her head for months, but she'd never spoken it aloud to anyone. Mrs. Thornhill stood by the window arranging flowers when Janie said softly, "I've been saving for a small place outside the city. Something simple, just for me and the baby." She smiled shyly, not expecting much of a response. Mrs. Thornhill turned, her expression thoughtful. "A small home of your own," she said. "That sounds lovely." She didn't press for details, but her tone carried warmth. The conversation moved on, yet the words lingered in her mind long after Janie left. Over the next few weeks, the Thornhills began to notice things others might have missed. The way Janie never complained about long hours. How she wiped down corners no one would ever see. How she smiled politely even when her movements slowed with fatigue. They saw quiet strength in her, something steady, unshaken by hardship. When she declined an offer to take a day off, saying she needed every hour she could get before the baby came, they exchanged a knowing glance but didn't argue. Instead, they began to plan in silence, though Janie had no idea. Meanwhile, Janie's savings continued to grow, each new entry in her notebook a victory. She'd cross out old goals and replace them with higher ones. $5,600 became $6,200, then $7,300. By her 8th month, she had saved $8,200, an amount she could hardly believe when she saw it written down. She ran her fingers over the numbers as if they might disappear. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. Yet she knew it still wasn't enough. Between the cost of a used tiny home, transportation, and the baby on the way, she was short by several thousand. The clock was ticking. Her due date was 6 weeks away, and her landlord had reminded her that infants weren't allowed in the building. Every time she passed him in the hallway, she felt his eyes follow her stomach. She tried not to panic. One more month, she told herself every morning. One more push. But her body was reaching its limit. The back pain grew worse, the walks to the station felt endless, and her hands sometimes cramped while scrubbing tiles. She'd stop, stretch, and whisper to her baby, "Hold on, sweetheart. We're almost there." Her clients noticed the change in her movements, but Janie brushed off their concern. When Mrs. Kowalski offered to buy her maternity shoes, she declined politely. When Mrs. Patterson told her to rest, she smiled and said, "I'm fine." Her pride wouldn't let her accept more than she already had. It was near the end of February when she visited the Thornhills again. Snow covered the driveway, and her breath came out in soft clouds as she carried her supplies to the door. Mrs. Thornhill greeted her warmly, insisting she come in to warm up before starting. "You must be freezing," she said, helping Janie out of her coat. "A little," Janie admitted, smiling. As she began cleaning the living room, Mrs. Thornhill watched her closely, her eyes soft with thought. That day felt like any other, but it would quietly change everything. Janie didn't know it, but her small act of sharing her dream had planted a seed in the Thornhills' minds, one that would soon grow into something far beyond her imagination. For now, she focused on what she could control: one more shift, one more dollar, one more page in the notebook. As she boarded the train home that evening, the city lights blurred past her window. Her body ached, but she pressed her hand to her belly and smiled faintly. She didn't know what awaited her, but she had come farther than anyone thought she could. Only 6 weeks stood between her and the future she'd fought for with every ounce of strength she had left. The October morning light carried a cool sharpness that hinted at the coming winter. Janie stepped off the trolley in Haverford, clutching her worn gloves as she made her way up the sloping street toward the Thornhills' brick home. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet leaves, her breath visible in small white clouds. She was slower now, 8 months along, her back aching, but she never missed a day. The Thornhills' house had become a place of quiet rhythm. Polish the wood banister, wash the kitchen tiles, dust the piano, hum softly to keep herself awake. That morning, everything felt ordinary. She hung her coat by the laundry room, tied her apron, and filled the bucket with warm water and vinegar. But before she could start, Mrs. Thornhill appeared in the hallway, dressed in her usual soft cardigan, her silver hair tied neatly at the back. "Janie," she said gently, "could you join me in the sunroom for a moment?" The tone caught Janie off guard. She'd never been called to sit before work. Her heart jumped. Was something wrong? Had she missed a spot? Broken something? The thought of losing one of her highest-paying clients made her chest tighten. "Yes, she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. The sunroom was bright, filled with the scent of lemon and old books. Autumn light streamed through the tall windows, warming the glass table where a teapot and 2 cups waited. Mrs. Thornhill gestured for her to sit. Janie hesitated before lowering herself carefully into the chair. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Mrs. Thornhill folded her hands. "I hope I'm not keeping you from your work. I just wanted to talk." Janie nodded politely, unsure what to say. "My husband and I have been thinking a great deal lately," Mrs. Thornhill began, her eyes drifting toward the garden beyond the glass. "We used to come out here often when our daughter was alive." Janie's breath caught. She hadn't known the Thornhills had lost a child. "She passed away when she was 12, Mrs. Thornhill continued quietly. "Leukemia. She would have been about your age now." Silence settled between them, soft but heavy. Janie felt a knot rise in her throat. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Thank you," Mrs. Thornhill said, her voice steady but tender. "It was a long time ago, but grief has a way of staying close. For years, we didn't speak about her. We traveled, buried ourselves in work, pretended the ache would fade. But when you first came here last year, Something about you reminded me of her. Janie blinked, confused. Me? Yes, Mrs. Thornhill said, a faint smile touching her face. Her name was Claire. She was strong-willed, full of determination. You have that same quiet fire. You work so hard, Janie. You never complain. Even when you were sick last winter, you came anyway. I've watched you push through exhaustion, balancing so much, and still you smile. Janie felt her eyes sting. I just try to do my best, she said softly. Mrs. Thornhill's gaze warmed. Do you remember mentioning a tiny home? When you were scrubbing the kitchen floor a few months ago, you said you were saving for one someday. Janie's hands froze in her lap. She did remember. Barely. It had been a passing comment, something she'd said half dreaming, more to herself than to anyone else. Yes, she murmured. I didn't think you'd remember. I did, Mrs. Thornhill said. In fact, my husband and I talked about it that evening. It stayed with us. We understood what that dream meant to you. She reached for a folder on the table and slid it toward Janie. Janie, we purchased a tiny home. We want you to have it. For a moment, Janie couldn't breathe. She stared at the folder as if it were written in another language. What do you mean? Mrs. Thornhill leaned forward slightly. It's yours. A fully built tiny home on 3 acres in Lancaster County, near Strasbourg. We bought the land years ago. It was meant to be a small weekend retreat for us, but we never used it. We've had the property maintained, and it's perfect for raising a child. Quiet, safe, surrounded by farmland. Janie's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The words hit her like a wave. I can't accept something like that, she managed to say. Before she could continue, Dr. Thornhill entered the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. His kind eyes met hers. You can, Janie, he said firmly. And you will. We've spoken to our attorney. Everything is already arranged. There's also a trust fund set up to cover property taxes, utilities, and baby expenses for the next 5 years. Janie covered her mouth, shaking her head. No, I can't let you do this. It's too much. Mrs. Thornhill reached across the table and placed a hand over Janie's trembling fingers. It's not charity. It's a gift. A thank you, for reminding us what resilience looks like. For bringing light back into this home. Tears blurred Janie's vision. The words blurred too. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. You don't know what this means to me. Yes, we do, Dr. Thornhill said gently. We've watched you carry more than most could handle. It's time someone carried a bit of that weight for you. Mrs. Thornhill opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, a property deed, and a photo of a sage-green tiny home surrounded by golden leaves. It's all ready, she said softly. You don't owe us anything. No payments. No conditions. Just a promise to build the life you've been working for. Janie pressed her palms against her cheeks, sobbing quietly. The months of exhaustion, the loneliness, the hunger, the aching feet, all of it washed through her in one overwhelming rush. For the first time in years, she felt something more powerful than fear. She felt seen. Mrs. Thornhill stood and embraced her. Our daughter would have loved you, she whispered. You remind me of everything she hoped to become. Janie's shoulders shook as she whispered back, Thank you, You've changed everything. Outside, the wind moved through the red and gold trees, scattering leaves across the yard as if the world itself were blessing what had just taken place. The following Saturday dawned clear and cool, a thin fog hugging the Delaware River as Janie waited outside her apartment with a single suitcase. Her breath formed small white clouds as she shifted from one foot to the other, nerves fluttering like restless birds in her chest. When the Thornhill's car pulled up, a silver sedan polished to perfection, Mrs. Thornhill waved from the front seat, her face glowing with quiet excitement. "Ready, dear?" she asked as Janey climbed in. Janey nodded, clutching her coat tightly. She still didn't quite believe any of this was real. The house, the land, the trust, it felt like a dream too fragile to touch. The drive began in silence, the city gradually giving way to the tree-lined suburbs of the main line. The roads widened, traffic thinned, and the skyline faded behind them like a distant memory. Mrs. Thornhill chatted softly about the route, how she used to take her daughter to orchards in Chester County, how the fall colors always seemed brighter past Exton. Dr. Thornhill focused on the road, occasionally pointing out landmarks, his tone gentle and calm. As they moved deeper into the countryside, Janey pressed her forehead against the cool window and watched the landscape transform. The streets of Philadelphia, worn and crowded, became winding country roads bordered by red barns and split-rail fences. Rows of cornfields stretched to the horizon, golden and bowed with the weight of harvest. Horses pulled black Amish buggies along the shoulder, their wheels whispering softly against the gravel. Laundry lines fluttered with plain dresses and shirts. Wooden signs advertised apple cider and homemade butter. It felt like another world, slower, kinder, untouched by the noise she'd always known. When they reached Lancaster County, the late morning sun had burned away the fog, revealing rolling farmland quilted with greens and golds. The air smelled faintly of hay and wood smoke. Every mile seemed to pull Janey closer to something she had never dared to hope for: peace. They turned onto a narrow gravel road lined with maple trees just beginning to shed their leaves. "We're almost there," Mrs. Thornhill said softly. "It's right at the end." The car crept forward, tires crunching on gravel. Then Janey saw it, a small sage greenhouse nestled between two tall oaks, sunlight catching the white trim around its windows. Smoke curled faintly from a metal chimney. A wooden porch framed the front, with a single rocking chair facing the fields beyond. The sight stole her breath. She opened the door and stepped out, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. For a long moment she simply stood there, taking in the stillness. The world was silent except for a distant crow and the soft rustle of trees. Mrs. Thornhill joined her, smiling. "Go on, dear," she said, pressing a small set of silver keys into her hand. Janey's fingers shook as she looked down at them. This was the moment she dreamed about during countless late nights cleaning floors, the moment she never thought would come. She walked slowly toward the front door, every step echoing in her chest. When the key slid into the lock and turned, her knees almost gave out. She pushed gently, and the door opened with a quiet creak. Warmth greeted her first, a soft scent of cedar and soap. Sunlight spilled across honey-colored wood paneling, making the interior glow. The space was small but perfect, a neat kitchen on one side with cream-colored cabinets and a butcher block counter, a tiny stove and apartment-sized fridge tucked neatly under open shelves. A small sofa faced a window overlooking the fields, and above the living area, a loft with a skylight promised starlit nights. Janey stepped inside, her eyes moving slowly over every detail. It wasn't just furnished, it was alive. A handmade Amish quilt rested over the back of the sofa, its careful stitches in muted blues and reds. The kitchen shelves were stocked with dishes, glass jars of flour and rice, tins of tea, and canned goods labeled neatly in cursive. She ran her hand over the smooth countertop, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's beautiful." Mrs. Thornhill stood in the doorway, her eyes glistening. "We wanted it to feel like home from the moment you walked in." Janey opened a narrow closet and froze. Inside hung a few neatly pressed dresses in her size, soft sweaters, a winter coat with the tag still on. On the lower shelf sat a basket of folded baby clothes, tiny socks and cotton onassis arranged with care. Her throat tightened as she turned toward the window. That's when she saw it, the small wooden cradle beside the glass, carved with delicate flowers along the sides. She reached out and touched the smooth rail, her fingertips tracing the grain. Dr. Thornhill stepped forward quietly. "I made that cradle 30 years ago," he said. "For our daughter. I wasn't sure I'd ever see it used again. It felt right to give it a new beginning." Janie covered her mouth, unable to speak. She could only nod, tears spilling freely. On the kitchen table lay an envelope. She opened it with trembling hands. Inside was the property deed, utility documents already set up in her name, and a letter in Mrs. Thornhill's elegant handwriting. "Dear Janie, welcome home. We hope this space brings you the peace and safety you've earned. You reminded us that compassion still has power in a world that often forgets it. This home is not charity. It's a thank you for showing us courage through kindness. May it be the start of something beautiful for you and your child. Love, Eleanor and Henry Thornhill." Janie lowered the letter, her chest rising and falling unevenly. The weight of every struggle, the cold nights, the aching feet, the hunger, seemed to lift all at once. She turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. This house was more than shelter. It was proof that her sacrifices had not been in vain. Her hand still trembled as she reached for the cradle again, resting her palm on its edge. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. Mrs. Thornhill crossed the room and shook her head gently. "You do, Janie. More than you know." For a long moment, the three of them stood in silence, sunlight filtering through the windows, falling across their faces. Outside, the trees whispered softly, and a distant church bell rang across the fields. Janie closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She was home. 6 weeks after moving into the tiny home, winter came quietly to Lancaster County. The air turned sharp, the trees bare, and the fields lay under a thin layer of frost. On a still Thursday night, as wind brushed softly against the windows, Janie went into labor. She called Mrs. Thornhill, her voice trembling but calm. Within an hour, help arrived, Mrs. Thornhill by her side, a local midwife from the nearby Amish community guiding her through each contraction. The hours were long, the pain fierce, but when dawn touched the horizon, a cry filled the small house. Janie held her newborn daughter against her chest, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. The baby's tiny fingers curled around hers, warm and perfect. "Grace," she whispered. "Your name is Grace. Because that's what brought us here." In that moment, surrounded by quiet, she felt the weight of every hardship melt away. The months of hunger, exhaustion, and fear seemed like a distant life. The tiny home, once a dream she could barely imagine, was now the backdrop to the most profound moment she'd ever known. Those first weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and gentle rhythms. Grace's cries echoed through the small rooms, but there was comfort in knowing she didn't have to rush anywhere. Janie fed her by the window where the cradle stood, the morning light spilling softly over them. The home's compact space turned out to be a blessing, everything within reach, easy to manage, safe and warm. Without the constant fear of eviction or overdue bills, motherhood felt different, hard but peaceful. The trust fund set up by the Thornhills covered the essentials, allowing Janie to focus on caring for her child. When Grace slept, Janie found herself standing at the window, watching snow drift across the fields, wondering how her life could have changed so completely. By spring, life in Lancaster had settled into a quiet rhythm. Neighbors from nearby farms began to visit, curious but kind. The Amish families living down the road introduced themselves with fresh bread and warm smiles. They admired the tiny home and offered advice on how to keep it warm through winter. One elderly woman named Miriam taught Janie how to garden in raised beds behind the house, showing her how to grow carrots, beans, and tomatoes in the rich soil. Through these simple acts, Janie began to feel a sense of belonging she hadn't known before. There was a peace here, a shared understanding that life didn't have to move fast to be meaningful. When she walked into the small-town store in Strasbourg, people greeted her by name. At church gatherings and community markets, she was no longer invisible. By summer, her garden had flourished. Rows of green stretched across the yard, and Grace, now 6 months old, watched from a blanket under the shade of a maple tree. The tiny home felt full, not with clutter, but with life. Janie returned to part-time cleaning, taking 2 or 3 clients a week in the nearby area. The work felt lighter now. She no longer dragged herself home after dark or counted every dollar with dread. The Thornhills Trust provided enough cushion that she could choose when to work and when to rest. Every month, Mrs. Thornhill came to visit, bringing new books for Grace and photographs of their daughter who had passed away. They would sit together on the porch, Grace asleep in her arms, while Mrs. Thornhill told stories of a bright, curious 12-year-old who loved art and laughter. Sometimes Dr. Thornhill joined, helping with small repairs or sharing a quiet lunch in the garden. They had become more than benefactors, they were family. When Grace began to crawl, the 3 acres around the home became her world. In summer, she chased fireflies until her tiny hands tired. In autumn, she played in piles of fallen leaves that Janie raked into the shape of hearts. Winter brought snow, and Janie bundled her daughter in thrift coats, helping her build lopsided snowmen under pale sun. Every season carried its own beauty. In spring, birds nested in the oak trees, their songs filling the mornings. At night, stars spread wide across the dark sky, unbroken by city lights. Janie would often step outside after Grace fell asleep, standing barefoot on the cool porch, looking up. The peace of rural life, the quiet, the stillness, felt almost sacred. Inside, the tiny home glowed with warmth. The walls, once bare, now held small frames of Grace's milestones: her first smile, her first steps, her first muddy garden day. Janie had found freedom not in abundance, but in simplicity. She often thought back to the version of herself who rode the train before dawn, clutching a plastic coffee cup, praying for strength to make it through another day. That woman had survived, yes, but this one had begun to live. On Grace's first birthday, the Thornhills came with a small cake and a handmade wooden toy shaped like a lamb. They sat together on the grass, laughter carrying through the air. Dr. Thornhill raised his cup of cider and said quietly, "This was meant to be, Janie. You were meant to find this place." She smiled through tears. "I think I was meant to find you, too." As dusk fell, fireflies blinked across the field. Grace clapped her hands, squealing at the tiny lights, while Janie watched her from the porch steps. For the first time in her life, she no longer feared what tomorrow might bring. The tiny home that once symbolized survival had become a foundation for something much greater: hope, peace, and love. Each night, before turning off the lamp, Janie whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, for the Thornhills, for Lancaster County, and for the miracle sleeping beside her. The journey that began with exhaustion and loss had led her here, to a quiet life filled with laughter and grace. Janie's journey became more than a story about hardship and reward. It was proof of what quiet perseverance can create when mixed with faith and kindness. Through every exhausting shift, every tear on the train, and every dollar carefully saved, she showed the dignity that comes from honest work. Her life reminded anyone watching that true worth isn't measured by title or paycheck, but by how one carries themselves when the odds are heavy. The Thornhills had seen that strength long before they ever thought of helping her. Dr. Thornhill often noticed how she arrived early and left late, how she carried herself with quiet pride no matter how menial the task. Even when her pregnancy began to show and simple chores became painful, she never asked for pity. Mrs. Thornhill later said that Janie's steadiness, her grace under pressure, reminded her of their daughter, who had faced illness with the same calm resilience. That was what touched them most deeply: Janie's unshakable hope. Their gesture of generosity was not charity but a response to character. It was proof that people still notice those who give their best when no one is watching. The Thornhills found healing in helping her, turning their grief into something meaningful. Through Janie, they rediscovered purpose, proof that love can take new forms even after loss. For Janie, the meaning ran deeper than financial relief. She realized that perseverance had built her foundation long before she ever received the keys to the tiny home. It wasn't luck that brought her to Lancaster. It was the quiet power of not giving up when the world had already counted her out. She carried that lesson into every new day, teaching Grace through example that strength isn't loud or boastful, it's steady and faithful. Word of Janie's transformation spread beyond Lancaster County. Other house cleaners in Philadelphia began sharing her story during lunch breaks and after church. Many of them started saving too, some opening their first bank accounts, others joining community workshops about budgeting and home ownership. Janie's story gave them permission to believe that even small beginnings could lead to something lasting. For the Thornhills, that ripple effect became their new calling. They began mentoring other young people facing difficult circumstances, offering guidance instead of money, teaching the same lessons they'd learned through Janie. Dr. Thornhill often told friends that helping her restored something he thought was gone forever, a sense that his life still mattered beyond his own comfort. In Strasbourg, Janie's tiny home became known as the little house that changed lives. Neighbors would bring newcomers by to hear her story, standing in the yard while Grace toddled through the grass. The sight of that small sage-green house among the trees reminded people that life's biggest changes don't always begin with grand gestures. They often start with someone refusing to give up. As the seasons passed, Janie and Grace built a simple, joyful rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of birds and the smell of coffee. Afternoons filled with laughter as Grace ran barefoot through the fields. Evenings brought quiet peace under a sky full of stars, something Janie once thought she'd never have the time or space to notice. Her journey stood as living proof that the American dream isn't lost, it just wears different clothes now. It lives in the small acts of persistence, in people who keep showing up, and in the unexpected kindness of strangers who decide to make a difference. Janie's story became a reminder that hard work still opens doors, that character still draws people's respect, and that miracles often come disguised as second chances. So as you listen to this story today, let it remind you of your own strength. Whatever road you're walking, no matter how far the goal seems, stay faithful to the work in front of you. Because somewhere down that road, someone might see your perseverance and decide to open a door you never expected. Thank you for watching. If Janie's journey moved you, take a moment to share where you're listening from in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's story. Together, we'll keep bringing you real stories of courage, transformation, and the quiet power of hope.